Well, thank all of you very much for your presentations. And I'm now going to ask the panelists to take a seat. Just from my own notes, I think there are some themes that have come out. For instance, investing now is really important, as we got from Jim Neumann. Communication was a big strand, I think, in all three presentations. And to that, I would add, talking in English so that there are clear distinctions in short old words about, which are a translation from mitigation and adaptation, which make no sense to the person in the street. And then sort of modeling the future in a way, and I'm adding my own comment to this, in a way that is not scary. Because if people get scared out of their wits, they tend to get paralysis. And so I think from earlier presentations we have seen, and this is a plug for the architectural and the landscape architect, the design professions, in that imagined futures to work towards, which can incorporate social equity, which all three of you were alluding to, I think can be a great impetus to that imagined future, which we really do have to learn to adapt to. So with that, I would invite additional questions or comments. Here's one for starting off with. What is the importance of developing a simple, straightforward narrative about mitigation and adaptation in getting people to support a positive, proactive approach to climate change? Now, what did I just say? Who would like to start on that?
The question is not what, it's how. I think if these narratives can be developed, can be co-produced by scientists and stakeholders, they have a lot more power than if somebody external to them develops a narrative and drops it on them.
Exactly. Since the time of Homer, we've learned that stories are the best way to communicate difficult messages.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think we're just now getting to the point where the science is actually able to sort out the different roles of mitigation and adaptation. The kinds of things I was showing you today are really hot off the press, but it's clear that that's a really important message to get across to folks. So clearly the importance is high. I think we all agree.
Yeah.
We have a question over here, Hubert.
Okay.
Let's start over there.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm a graduate student in the science in oceanography. And I noticed that a few of you talked in this session about how long it takes for science to get published, and those IPCC assessments, for example, take many years. So by the time they're published, it's a bit outdated and compared to real time. And the last speaker, sorry, I'm blanking.
Wilbanks.
Wilbanks, right. You're saying, though, that there's also inadequacy of information, or that we need more information to act now. So could you comment on how to kind of reconcile those things? Because I know, being a graduate student, I know that science is quite slow, but if we need information soon, like what do you think would be the right
I think one of the messages from both the IPCC report and the National Climate Assessment is that there are things that we can do now that will make us more resilient without waiting to reduce uncertainties about a lot of things related to climate change. We can improve our ability to monitor what's going on so we can watch what's happening. We can improve our ability to learn from what other people are trying to see what works. We can improve our awareness of the issues and our knowledge of the science within our own communities, in our schools, and in our businesses, and so on. There is a branch of science, decision analysis, that RAND Corporation is doing, which is called robust decision-making under conditions of deep uncertainty, which says we're never going to reduce uncertainties to zero. We always, in our own lives, we deal with uncertainty all the time. We can come up with approaches that look at our futures and things we should be doing now that are appropriate for a wide range of possible futures rather than just for a single best guess. And there are plenty of those good ideas to use, especially if they benefit other things than just climate change resilience alone.
I think that you've made some good points here about science moving slowly, but one thing that you ought to realize is in everything that we presented in this symposium, I think we probably could have presented 5 or 6 years ago, but might have been reluctant to do so for scientific reasons. At least, maybe not Margaret, but Tom and I maybe. And I think, so you need to recognize that science moves slow because it has to be deliberative and it has to be consensual in many respects. I mean, the fact is 95% of scientists have agreed about humans as a cause of climate change for a lot of years now. We just don't reflect the general population. So there needs to be that care so we don't make a misstep. If we predict something and it doesn't turn out to be true, then we've lost all credibility. But that doesn't mean that the lessons for human action are necessarily different because of that carefulness than they were, say, 5 or 6 years ago. So I would argue that a lot of the communication of messages that we're pressing now could have happened a long time ago based on the science we had 5 or 6 years ago. So yes, be frustrated about the slow pace of science, acknowledge that there's a reason for it, but there's an awful lot that can be communicated. The message I had about acting now, I could have made to you 15 years ago based on research we were doing.
We did do it, but it is important that we do have authoritative sources. I mean, that is one of the reasons that the process of the IPCC and now the U.S. National Climate Assessment is so deliberative, so protracted. It's authoritative. But you can be credible without being authoritative. So when these guys talk about uncertainty, it has a particular kind of meaning. So we're uncertain if we're talking 2 or 3 meters by 2060. That we're uncertain. But the fact that stuff is going to happen and it's going to rise a lot faster over the next few decades, we're all in furious agreement about that. It's just a really, unfortunately, it's a semantical and a cultural issue. I think scientists have to be scientists, but that's why there's also room for other people in other organizations, boundary organizations. I spoke about the importance of them. These guys, the way they get their money, they have to be both credible and authoritative. I don't have to be authoritative. I'm just a lawyer.
Well, one of the things that's increased receptivity to the kind of things Jim's talking about is the recent succession of extreme events. Yes. It's been suggested that focal events open policy windows. If they don't stay open very long, but if you're ready with good science and good advice when people are looking for things to do, then that can make a difference over the long term.
So if you already have your contingent plan and the next whatever hits you, then you could just pull it out of the drawer instead of running around like Chicken Little. I mean, one of the reasons New York experienced less damage than it might have just 5 years ago was because of Bloomberg's planned New York City Commission. He had some balloons in a bunch of those subways that were ready to be blown up. They just didn't have enough balloons and enough subways. But they were already going down that path. So they actually saved themselves some damages.
Absolutely.
And we can do that because the trend line on extreme events is very clear. Stuff is happening faster and more extreme.
I don't know if this is a question or just a barrage of unconnected thoughts that come out of this whole conference. Walking into this session, I was thinking the one missing piece was what does life look like in 2100 and beyond, and do we need to envision what that might be to decide on what direction we're heading in? Which direction do we want to head in? It's going to be different. What you're saying now is if U.S. coastal cities or any coastal cities stay where they are and grow where they are, we're going to have a very different life then. And what is that life going to be, or what do we want it to be? And what do we do now to direct it?
San Francisco Bay Area, which is actually about 48 local jurisdictions, as part of a long-term effort, actually had an extensive community visioning process. It was called ART, Adapting to Rising Tides. And they invited people to come in and imagine the future. Are we talking about Sausalito becoming a mega city, you know, or are lots of people going to be in houseboats? Can we put our strip malls on pontoons? I mean, some of it was that out there, but some communities are imagining how they could redesign, not just on land, but out in water as well. And I think that's an important discussion to be having anyway, because that's part of how a community comes together, is imagining what they want that future to be.
There is one family of work in scenario construction that says rather than just trying to project where we're going, we should start with where we want to be and figure out how we get from here to there, and then track how we can see whether we're on that track as we move through time. One other comment, about 5 years ago, the Union of Concerned Scientists produced an excellent report on climate change impacts in the 9 northeastern states, which had an interesting kind of visualization of changes that showed for states like New York and Pennsylvania over the time between now and the end of the century, how their climates would change and where the climates are like that now, like the Carolinas and Georgia. It said, where you're going right now is the climates in Pennsylvania are going to become like the climates in North Georgia. Is that what you want? What does that mean for you and for your sense of place and for your livelihoods and for your children and grandchildren? Your point is an important one and one we need to think about.
So just to add a minor thought to that, part of my training is actually, in addition to economics, as a planner. So I'm very much supportive of a lot of the things that Tom talked about with the visualizations and getting people to imagine what things could look like. When it comes to planning, though, I think in my own experience thinking about adaptation planning, what I found is it's very difficult to get a large group of people to agree on a single vision for the future, and then even harder to get them to agree on the path to get there. But you can much more readily get people to agree if you turn this around and you think about options that are closed off by not taking action. And that's actually a relatively straightforward alternative way of looking at this. You tend to get a lot more agreement about not wanting to go in a certain direction, which we would be headed if we didn't take action.
Yeah. What you don't want as well as what you want.
And one of the other tricks of the trade is you can't always get a straight-up climate adaptation plan, but you can get money to do multi-hazard mitigation plans. Mm-hmm. There are infrastructure plans. Many cities have sustainability plans. Mm-hmm. We call this mainstreaming. So you can always embed strategies that we might label as climate adaptation under some other set of activities, the 5-year master plan. That's what we did down in Miami-Dade. We embedded it in the infrastructure plan and in the sustainability plan and in the regional growth plan. There wasn't actually a climate plan, a climate adaptation plan, but it is going on in Miami-Dade now for that reason.
In fact, in many cases, if you talk to local decision makers who have limited resources or even sources of funding, putting a lot of money into adaptation to reduce risk of long-term climate change impacts, you're putting a lot of money into something that may not ever occur. You need to show some value added from that investment in the relatively near term, which usually means helping with other sustainable development objectives as well as climate change impact adaptation.
I think if I can just add to those comments, a sort of theme weaving through a lot of your presentations was this whole issue of the difficulty of democracy, just decision making and getting a quorum in a time of emergency. So preparing oneself ahead of time when, pre-emergency to make the sort of decisions that are necessary. And then you run into the problem of people who have, major preoccupations other than the long-term climate change, such as, in my experience, doctors and nurses are saving lives. They don't have time to think about this long-term catastrophe because there's something happening today. And people who are very poor are thinking about how they're going to feed the kids tonight, rather than what's happening in 40 years' time. So that's why communication and visioning to all those types of audiences is very important. There was somebody up here, another person.
Yes, hi, thank you all. It's been really terrific. I'm working on a sustainability plan for a small coastal city in Massachusetts, and we're embedding in that plan environmental resiliency and basically a coastal adaptation plan. And over the last 3 days, we've just had thrown at us so many different maps, sources from maps, and I'm trying to get to the nub of what's the best source for us to go to online, because we don't have any funding for this plan, to start to show people the potential impacts if we do have sea level rise and storm surge.
So Digital Coast just Google Digital Coast. You'll get visualization tools. They're built in. You don't have to buy a license. The training and how to run them is right there. It's in a GIS format. Right now it's sea level rise. Over the next 6 months, we'll actually be adding sea level rise and surge. As soon as the storm season gets past.
Okay, thank you.
And another one we talked about earlier, where a sort of private sector effort that comes out of Climate Central is called Surging Seas, which is another nice visualization tool, which, because they don't have the same limitations that Margaret's office has about
authoritative and credible.
There you go. They can take some chances. So they actually have a sort of risk calculator, and they let you choose what type of storms you think might be likely, or put another way, that you think are credible and reasonable to plan for,
but in the Northeast,
and do some mapping. And so that's a nice alternative.
There are three
and
parts
they have economics in there too. So
yeah, economics is important. Thank you.
I should learn not to cut you off, Margaret.
No. Economics is important. In fact, that's an often neglected part. But I just wanted to say, in the Northeast in particular, because of the projections for rainfall, you actually are not going to find the site that gives you sea level rise, surge, and coastal flooding. So many coastal communities have now found that these precipitation events are so pregnant with precipitation that they're increasingly more worried about what's coming back down the river than what came in by the sea.
Right.
So that has not yet occurred in the world of modeling. It's joint probabilistic modeling, and you have to bring together at least 3 different models, and apparently there's some reason modelers haven't gotten there yet, but I have hopes they will in the near future. So that's the only downside to all these easy to access things. The economic data, Jim's firm, you really do need to dig a little more for the economic and the social data. But there's also some publicly available data, right, about critical infrastructure through the National Infrastructure Project. So
yes.
What's that website?
I don't have it in my head, but I can.
We'll give it to Judith.
Get Tom's card.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the clarification.
And then just one more thing, from your presentation, actually, Margaret, tell stories about other folks who've done these things, and there's some nice success stories from the National Climate Assessment that you actually referred to in one of your graphics, and that's a great way to get people to understand what they might be getting into with some of these adaptation plans.
Let me mention one other possibility. I think I mentioned the White House local, state, and tribal leaders task force, which has been set up and is very active. I think if you were to contact them, one of the things they've been asked to do for the federal government is to identify ways that cities are meeting these needs, and to sort of say, here are some things that have worked in different places, and you could probably get some models from that, where without money they've been able to get community organizations to take the initiative in doing a study like this, or to involve the local schools in doing it as a school project, or something that advances the discussion in the community without direct funding.
Okay, thank you. And I appreciate the clarification on sea level rise, storm surge, and coastal flooding, because a lot of the coastal communities in Massachusetts, mine included, we're right on the mouth of a major river and on the ocean.
Situate?
No, not Situate. It's north, Newburyport.
And there's a tendency when we look at coastal storms to forget that the coastal storms continue to raining when they go inland, and the flooding comes back out to the coast rather than just coming from the ocean.
Thank you.
One more?
Hi. So one of the biggest problems I deal with in my job is going to the higher ups and putting in our capital investment plan and other things, a positive cost-benefit analysis, but for these adaptation measures. Right. Do you know of any economic tools, specifically like micro scale, that I could apply to my organization to, come up with these, no adaptation scenarios, mitigation and adaptation scenarios, extensive adaptation scenarios, to, come up with this cost-benefit analysis that would fund me?
I'm going to say it's not that simple, sorry. It's actually, what I presented to you is a nice way of thinking about things in a screening approach for a particular site. Because what I'm doing here is I'm looking across, when I showed you the types of benefit cost analyses that I do, we're looking across the entire country and using a consistent approach throughout, but we're leaving aside a lot of the context specificity. The minute you get down to a context-specific approach, the costs and benefits are really complicated to start to think about. And so each of these plans is a new effort that needs to recognize there's a complex interaction with where how humans want to use space and what they can do with money to, take action to maintain those sorts of uses.
But again, I think this is an example of something that can benefit from co-production of the analysis, involve the local private sector and the development community, as well as local experts in government, and sometimes some interesting things come out of that interaction.
Yeah, I definitely want to make a plug for a stakeholder-based approach as a starting point. You don't have to do the same sort of numbers on costs and benefits in order to be credible as a benefit cost analysis. You can actually run a stakeholder process that identifies costs of certain actions and benefits of certain actions, some of which are denominated in dollars and some of which are not. And that's a good framework for starting to think about where the actions come out. And then you can actually do interactive work to try to identify where the priorities are from among the options.
The process may be as important as the product.
Don't know where you are in the metropolitan area, and I'm presuming you are in the metropolitan area, but you might also tap into one of the universities and try and get a studio project going with the public administration. There'll be a master's of public administration, or close by there's a school of management, or you mentioned the School of Landscape Architects, who are probably the best systems thinkers in universities these days. And they often do run these things called studio projects, which are supposed to be hands-on experience for relatively fresh graduate students. You might see if you couldn't talk some schools, some professional part of a local university into maybe doing a studio project. I did something like that for Newport, Rhode Island. I did traffic counts for Newport, Rhode Island when I was in graduate school for free.
Thank you.
With that, I would like to ask you to join me in thanking our three panelists very much for their presentation. And Judy.
Thanks so much. It's great to see you. I'm glad I didn't have to follow you.
So it's only, sometimes I always regret waiting to the end to thank all the people who have been so helpful in making this conference possible. So I'd like to thank all of the steering committee members, and I probably won't remember everybody's names, but if you all would stand up, so Joe Savage, Hubert Murray, I think Brad, Jack Wiggin, Paul Kirschen, you're in the back somewhere, Julie Simpson, and is there somebody else I've forgotten who, there are other people who aren't here today. Hannah, are you? Oh, Hannah was. Jim Rowan? Sorry. And then the people on the MIT staff have just been incredible. And there are two people I would like to thank. One is Gail Sherman, who is our logistics person. Gail. And Lily Paquette, who's been taking pictures of everybody. Where are you, Lily?
Lily's minding the table, so
All right, well, we'll send her in. And then we also thank all of our funders, the Boston Harbor Foundation, Sasaki Partners, the Urban Harbors Institute, and, pardon me? The Boston, did I say not to say the Boston Foundation? Oh, the Boston Foundation, thank you. Big difference, very big difference. Kleinfelder, and then ICON and some smaller people, some smaller organizations who help to support having students come. So I'm very thankful to all of them as well. And I don't know if Lily is back, but we will certainly thank her when she gets back. I thought if I could just take a few minutes to kind of summarize a couple of thoughts about the symposium, what we tried to do, and I think we came close to it, but we certainly have a long ways to go. Our initial intent was to really provide a good, strong background for all of the various sessions, and we scheduled our talks to kind of go from sort of the scientific and technical, the modeling efforts, if you will, to later sessions that focused more on the planning and the infrastructure, the built infrastructure, and and so forth. And so we kind of tried to sequence and segue ourselves through here to, of course, the day's panel that kind of has really, with all of their joint experiences in these various fields, brought it all together and really made it, come alive, I think, for us in terms of what we still need to do. And certainly kudos to all of the speakers and the moderators who helped make this happen. you know, as we look forward and we know we need to embrace the carbon footprint, reduce emissions, reduce energy, or embrace energy conservation, and look for new energy sources, we have to realize, and I think, Tom, your graph today showed that it makes very little difference. And yes, 2 days ago, one of the systems analysts from the Sloan School had they call it C-ROADS. It's a decision-making process for it's a process for decision makers to look at the changes that reducing carbon will make in temperature. And it's, you know, basically it's within the margin of error, it's 0. So even if we started today, you know, we aren't going to see a lot of change in some of the things that's going on. And I think that's really, to me, very sobering. But having said that doesn't mean we stop. And of course, we need to keep going in that direction because it does and it can reduce the adaptation issues that we have to take in the future. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of things that I hope you all will take home as messages. One is we saw a number of models being presented by our speakers and the science that they brought into helping to define those models and the areas of those models. And so we talked about the bathtub model, which is really inadequate these days for helping people make decisions, for planners to make decisions. We talked about things like the AdCirc and the SWAN models, which give you a much more dynamic, hydrodynamic model along with wave action. And these are things that at least Boston has embraced in some of the communities around here. And yet these need some very sophisticated people to come in and help the communities use those. We also talked about some very high-end models. The FVCOM, the finite volume community ocean model, that is a 3-dimensional model. It's probably one of the more sophisticated, needs a tremendous amount of data in order for the predictions and the forecasts to be as reliable as we would like them to be. And similarly, there's the high fidelity model that is looking to look at waves very close to shore as we see these extreme events come in. But the point I'm trying to make, I guess, with all of these is the models aren't the end-all and be-all, as one of our speakers said. You know, we need the models to help us make forecasts, but all models are wrong and some are useful. Nonetheless, this is what we have to work with, and we want to be able to build on that. And then Margaret and others have pointed out some of the other options that we have. We covered a lot of different issues. For me, one of the take-home messages was the social responsibility session, where we had folks from Chelsea talk about how the poor are living on their coast, how a 2-square-mile city of 35,000 blows my mind, and has 120 different languages in their school, is facing, you know, continued problems with floodplains, with people in the floodplain, and that their hope of building out on their waterfront is really kind of in uncertain areas, obviously, in an uncertain area, because obviously with floodplain, high insurance and so forth, you know, it's not clear that they're going to be able to move forward. We're looking forward at MIT Sea Grant and working with students from Worcester Polytechnic Institute to help at least deal with or frame some of the vulnerable areas that the city has identified. And then that brings me, there are a lot of other things that I really would like to kind of talk about, but I know we're all getting tired, and perhaps the best thing to do is just kind of summarize in terms of where we're going to go next. The only other issue, though, I think that has come through in a lot of this is, you know, if we're really concerned about all of this, we need to follow money. And I think that it's fair to say that the utilities and the builder and the development community didn't come in with some really strong statements about what they would like to see or where they're going next. And I think we need to really start to work with some of these folks to make some of their impacts be more meaningful.